Good morning and welcome, everybody. My name is David Lincicum. I teach New Testament and related subjects here, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all this morning. I'd like to begin by giving us about 15 seconds of silence to center ourselves before we enter into this session. All right, thank you. Well, this morning we have a paper from Drew Strait, The Bible and Human Security, Why Biblical Interpretation Matters for Challenging Christian Nationalism. So Drew will speak for about 22 minutes, and then we'll have two responses from Kristin Dumais and Matthew D. Taylor. So I'll go ahead and introduce all of them now, if I don't drop their bios. And then we'll have one after the other. There will also up here, there's actually here now, the QR code. So if as you listen to the presentation and the responses, questions occur to you, please feel free to scan the code and submit your questions, and we'll take some of those up as we're able to in the question and answer. So Drew Strait is a New Testament professor at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. His scholarship focuses on discursive resistance, political idolatry, and peacemaking in early Christianity. In recent years, his work has taken on a more public-facing focus as he applies his scholarship to support faith communities and the public seeking to understand and challenge the growth of Christian nationalism, violent extremism, and Christian supremacy. Drew can frequently be found visiting faith communities across the country, teaching accessible short courses, and leading seminars accessible to public audiences. He is the author of Strange Worship, 6 Steps for Challenging Christian Nationalism, and his paper today is part of a forthcoming edited volume in Routledge Studies in Fascism and the Far Right series. Kristin Dumais is a New York Times bestselling author and professor of history at Calvin University. She's currently a research fellow here at the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Notre Dame. She holds a Ph.D. from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. She's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, Religion News Service, and Christianity Today, has been interviewed on NPR, CBS, and the BBC, among other outlets. Her most recent book is Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Matthew D. Taylor is the senior Christian scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, where he specializes in American Christianity, American Islam, Christian extremism, and religious politics. His new book, The Violent Take It by Force, The Christian Movement That is Threatening Our Democracy, which appeared with Broadleaf in 2024, tracks how a loose network of charismatic Christian leaders called the New Apostolic Reformation was a major instigating force of the January 6th insurrection and is currently reshaping the culture of that religious right in the US. Taylor holds a Ph.D. in religious studies and Muslim Christian relations from Georgetown University and an MA in theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. He also serves as an associate fellow at the Center for Peace, Diplomacy in New Orleans, where he works on preventing religion-related violence surrounding US elections. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Christians turn out to be among the leading threats to democracy in much of the world. This was written by Baptist theologian David Gushee in his book, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. In the U.S. context, Christians turn to what Gushee calls authoritarian reactionary Christian politics is not linear, but it does have a coherent, deep story rooted in the legacies of white supremacy, the doctrine of discovery, and patriarchy. If the January 6th Capitol insurrection is any indication, the Bible was a source of inspiration for authoritarian reactionary Christian politics, as insurrectionists sang worship songs to Jesus, read scripture publicly, blew shofars, waved Bibles over their heads, made apostolic decrees, marched with appeal to heaven flags, performed exorcisms, and held large placards of white Jesus with a MAGA hat on as they sought to violently overturn a democratic election. These images are so colorful and communicate so forcefully, it wouldn't be hard for me to spend the next 20 minutes in the realm of the descriptive, cataloging myriad ways the Bible has been wielded by contemporary U.S. Christians to lord their power over others. We could talk about when Donald Rumsfeld placarded classified intelligence briefings during the Iraq War with dominionist Bible verses. A U.S. defense contractor inscribed 800,000 rifle scopes with 2 Corinthians 4:6 because God apparently was on America's side of the gun during the Iraq War. Christian gun owners appealed to Luke 22:38 to justify personal armament and school shootings as just collateral damage. Trump did a photo op with a Bible at Lafayette Square. Jeff Sessions quoted Romans 13 to legitimate Trump's draconian child separation policy. President Trump boasted that no one reads the Bible more than me and grifted God Bless the USA Bibles during Holy Week on Truth Social for $59.99. Ron DeSantis called on Floridians to put on the full armor of God and take a stand against the left's schemes. We could talk about viral biblical memes that portray Trump as King Cyrus, David, Jehu, and Trump's female political opponents as Jezebel. Christians who interpreted Trump's assassination attempt at 6:11 p.m. as an allusion to Ephesians 6:11, whereby Trump was interpreted as protected by the full armor of God. And we could talk about Elon Musk's current quest for a viper's nest in the federal government. These biblical allusions and proof texts are the tip of an iceberg. While each warrants serious analysis, submerged under their icy waters is an ethno-nationalist group identity that has little to do with the Bible's story of salvation, peace, and justice, and everything to do with belonging and power. I call these uses and abuses of the Bible for political propaganda, theologies of oppression, direct and cultural violence, and megalomaniacal purposes, biblical authoritarianism. Put simply, anytime the Bible is used to lord power over others through direct, cultural, or structural violence, it functions not as an authoritative text, but as an authoritarian text. The use and reception of the Bible for authoritarian reactionary Christian politics raises underexplored questions about how particular ways of reading and using the Bible are radicalizing Americans, along with how the Bibles of the American religious right work. It also raises difficult questions for clergy and seminary professors, myself included, who are imagining how to interrupt processes of radicalization and disengage adherents of white Christian nationalism through more responsible and life-giving ways of reading the Bible for the common good. But I found that this work of disengagement is delicate, especially during these times of hyperpartisanship and polarization. Too often, those intending to interrupt slip into inflammatory and dehumanizing language, caricature, and essentializing religious extremists as stupid or crazy. The latter is quite commonly resorted to as a disingenuous form of protest among progressives on platforms like X. We actually have little evidence that far-right extremists are stupid, socially isolated, or crazy. And perhaps more importantly, as Paulo Freire reminds us, dehumanizing the dehumanizer has the obverse effect of dehumanizing oneself. As I've worked with faith leaders around the United States, pastors often ask, how can my 20-minute sermon and Sunday school classes keep up with the dozens of hours my congregants spend listening to right-wing radio, Fox News, YouTube influencers, and broligarchy podcasts? The answer is that sermons can't keep up. The moment we are living in calls for us to scale up realistic, creative, and carefully crafted strategies of nonviolent resistance, even if our primary audience is to the choir. Immunity from Christian nationalism cannot be assumed. It must be nurtured, including inside of historic Peace Church traditions. Before I discuss interventions, allow me to reflect more on the role of the Bible in authoritarian reactionary Christian politics. A key predictor of adherence of Christian nationalism is belief in the Bible. This includes belief in the Bible as the literal word of God and is perfectly true. Roughly 20% of Americans are biblicists, and studies have shown that biblical literalists are more likely to embrace conspiracy theories and to hold negative views of science. More recently, the Public Religion Research Institute found that among Americans who report reading the Bible weekly or more, 55% are Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers. The correlation between Bible reading and threats to democracy are also observable. In a 2022 Pew Research Center poll, roughly 27% of Americans said that the Bible should have more influence over U.S. laws than the will of the people if the two conflict. Biblical interpretation is a human security issue, especially since adherents of Christian nationalism are twice as likely as other Americans to believe that violence may be justified because things have gotten so far off track in the United States. In my research on Christian dominionism, I spent a great deal of time excavating biblical authoritarianism in R.J. Rushdoony's Christian Reconstruction movement, the New Apostolic Reformation, white neo-reformed Christian nationalism, and a case study on former Washington State Republican Representative Matt Shea, who authored a leaked document called The Biblical Basis for War. Among these interpreters, an authoritarian hermeneutic is evident in their arbitrary selection of passages from ancient Israelite legal codes and violent Old Testament texts to construct and proof text their vision of a Christian nation. Attention to the historical context of these passages through modern methods of biblical interpretation are either pushed aside or castigated as demonic. What's especially striking about this authoritarian hermeneutic is its complete omission of passages from the Old Testament on love, grace, charity, welcoming strangers, anti-imperial sources, and humility, not to mention a complete disregard for the moral vision of the life and teachings of Jesus. To oppose biblical authoritarianism's exegetical gymnastics, we must accept that dominionist readings of the Bible are incubating Christian extremism and democratic backsliding. Because the Bible is shared sacred scripture between Christian nationalists and Christians challenging Christian nationalism, theologians, pastors, and biblical scholars are uniquely positioned to theorize and implement preemptive interventions within a distinctively Christian vernacular. This work will take devoted communities of practice and inevitably lots of trial and error. Toward this work, I have 5 proposals for intervention. First, we need more public-facing, sorry about that. Oh, I'm sorry, it didn't go through. My bad. First, we need more public-facing biblical interpretation. Christian nationalists expertly market their reading of the Bible in public. The entrepreneurial self is a high virtue in Christian nationalist circles, with some leaders calling themselves digital missionaries as they interpret the Bible publicly through viral biblical memes, TikToks, podcasts, live-streamed Bible study, improv preaching in public, including on airplanes, and they claim to oversee conversions internationally through Instagram DMs. This vast online infrastructure has operationalized and even commodified biblical authoritarianism for lucrative ends. A recent interview with the historian David Hollinger brings the importance of public biblical interpretation into focus. Hollinger argues that progressive ecumenical Christians have kept up a sophisticated conversation in the seminaries about biblical hermeneutics, but have been relatively silent in public about how deficient they find evangelical views of the Bible. Meanwhile, according to Hollinger, the public thinks that the progressive and evangelical divide is about racism, sexism, and homophobia, when it's equally about biblical interpretation. Progressives' reticence to argue about the Bible in public has, quote, yielded to evangelicals much of the symbolic capital of Christianity. And I want to say here that Christian nationalists more or less own the Bible right now in public discourse. To reclaim the Bible, Hollinger argues, you have to actually make arguments and in public. Let the reader understand. Second, clergy and biblical scholars must collaborate to map and reconstruct the Bibles of the American far right. One of the strangest realities about living in this moment is that Christian nationalists and Christians challenging Christian nationalism both appeal to the Bible as sacred and as a sacred and authoritative text, and yet draw radically different and even opposing visions of discipleship and human belonging. These competing visions over biblical interpretation are nothing new in U.S. history. As Mark Knoll argues, the Civil War, with its pro- and anti-slavery Bibles, was an interpretive standoff over biblical interpretation as much as it was a political standoff. As we confront our own interpretive standoff, many biblical scholars are still at step one of hermeneutical sobriety, which is acceptance. We need to accept that most Christians in the U.S. don't read or want to read the Bible like scholars do, from left to right, and with attention to critical hermeneutical methods. Instead, the public reads the Bible frenetically, out of context, haphazardly, therapeutically, and even anachronistically. This is not an exception, it is the norm. The public also doesn't read canonically. They read the Bible in bits and pieces, a meme here, a memory verse there, a sermon pericope here, a billboard scripture there, a bumper sticker here, a bit of Bible on Christian radio there. The negative adage that many of us were taught in seminary, that a text without a context is a pretext for a proof text, has been transformed into a virtue rather than a vice. A reading strategy whereby, in the words of Robert Miles, biblical texts in popular culture remove the text from canonical control altogether, enabling different meaning and reality effects to emerge. To meet this moment, we need better tools to excavate and understand these reality effects. Historical criticism will hardly save us from this moment of biblical authoritarianism, but reception history might. Reception history is crucial because it offers a methodology for animating what texts do rather than what texts mean as they occur out in the wild. No one has pursued this methodological line of thought with more sophistication than Hannah Strumman, whose recent book, The Bibles of the Far Right, interrogates Bible use in the manifesto of the Norwegian terrorist Anders Breivik. In moving beyond interpretosis, which is obsession with meaning, Strumman invites us to move from questions of what is a Bible to which Bible. Strumman offers a methodological handrail for reconstructing the Bibles of American Christian nationalists, including what I'm calling the American Culture War Bible. Toward this end, some of us who are biblical scholars may need to take a break from exegeting our beloved primary sources and from studying Jesus in film to exegete Bible use in far-right pamphlets, placards, manifestos, web pages, podcasts, and social media posts. As Strumman concludes, we cannot take it for granted that we know what the Bible of the Christian right is until we see it in use. Third, we must work with organizers and faith leaders to build counter-narratives in attitudinal inoculation. I got caught up in the moment. These are the words of capital insurrectionist Josiah Colt from Idaho, who was memorably photographed swinging from the Senate balcony onto the floor in full tactical gear, ready for a boogaloo, which is a right-wing code word for a civil war. When idolaters of power are caught up in the moment, there's no turning back. This is a reminder that the events leading up to getting caught up in the moment are what matter the most for the work of disengagement and peacemaking. No one becomes an idolater of power in their sleep. This is a process and not a moment. According to the Pyrrhus database, radicalization among domestic extremists in the U.S. is a slow process that on average takes 5 or more years. Disturbingly, these numbers accelerate to a year or less among adherents of QAnon conspiracy theories. As disturbing as this is, I choose to see this, pastorally speaking, as good news. It means we have 1 to 5 years to get in the way with a better Christian narrative of human belonging and power. To be sure, adherents of Christian nationalism lean heavily on narratives to spread their ideology and attract and recruit followers. For this reason, some scholars prefer to use the language of recruitment rather than radicalization. Narratives are a powerful recruitment tool because they can be wielded to call vulnerable persons to action, through a sense of duty, victimization, religious reward, belonging, sense of purpose, and desire for adventure. Recent scholarship has shown that extremist recruitment narratives can be challenged through counter-narratives or attitudinal, inoculative messaging. We even have empirical evidence that counter-narratives work to curtail psychological reactance to extremist propaganda. In 2018, Kurt Braddock exposed 357 participants to inoculative messaging before reading left or right-wing propaganda. Braddock found that inoculation negatively predicted perceptions of an extremist group's credibility. But to effectively counter these recruitment narratives, we first need to understand them. This means creating intentional spaces for scholars, faith leaders, and students to step out of the comfort of our own theological silos to listen to and analyze the narrative theology that funds Christian nationalism. After analyzing and identifying key themes in this material, we can collaborate to build counter themes and narratives that target radicalizing motifs. But to be clear, when I reference counter narratives here, I'm not referring to the Islamic counter-terror programs of the security state. Here, I'm inviting us to the careful work of theological animation to leverage analogs and polemics in the Bible and the life and teachings of Jesus that are fundamentally at odds with Christian supremacy and the idea that America is a Christian nation. Fourth, we must offer biblical alternatives to dominionist eschatologies of coercion. When I was in seminary, I remember learning about the difference between premillennialism and postmillennialism at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and then at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Surprisingly, neither of these institutions that represent two opposite ends of the theological spectrum taught me to associate postmillennialism with the Christian Reconstruction movement's victorious eschatology. I think that's a mistake, especially since 60% of evangelicals today believe that the church is supposed to build the kingdom of God on earth before Jesus comes back. That is a stunning number. The American religious right's current evolution from a predominantly left-behind rapture eschatology to a Trumpian anti-rapture victorious eschatology is underreported by pastors and biblical scholars. To put this in perspective, I'm teaching the book of Revelation this semester, and I can't find a single introductory text that brings students into conversation with a postmillennial victorious eschatology that undergirds NAR leaders, many NAR leaders at least, and neo-reformed Christian nationalists. The magnitude of this subtle but substantive shift among conservative evangelicals is felt in Andrew Torba and Andrew Eisger's Biblical Guide for Making a Christian Nation. They write, "The time for being a Christian wimp is over. Christian nationalists will awaken the American Christian mind and lift the veil on over a century of lies. If we change our eschatology, we will change the world and take dominion for the glory of God. We can't and won't disciple a nation of dispensational doomers. I say this from a place of love because I too was once one. I bought into the left-behind eschatology wholesale as a kid, but when I grew up and read my Bible, I didn't find a story of doom and gloom. I found the truth of Christ's triumphant victory." For Torba and Eisger, Christ's triumphant victory is an invitation to literally disciple nations coercively from the top down rather than wait around passively for the rapture. To challenge victorious eschatology, we need to first offer compelling biblical alternatives rooted in a vision of eschatological flourishing for all humans. We also need to do the hard work of disentangling Christian nationalism from superficial forms of eschatological superstition and political biblicism that are unmoored from the teachings of Jesus, especially as it relates to Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is the foreign policy of Christian nationalism. Here, the Protestant notion of sola scriptura and the plain sense of Scripture deserve thoughtful scrutiny since they have contributed to a context where everyone is a Bible expert and pastors and Bible scholars are the least trusted when it matters the most. Fifth, and finally, we must correct dominionist readings of Genesis 1 and Matthew 28. Christian dominionism's theology of power is largely built on Genesis 1:27 through 28, the Great Commission in Matthew 28:18 through 21, and when convenient, an excerpt from the Lord's Prayer, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Taken together, these passages are treated as a canon within the canon for Christian nationalists' vision of taking dominion. Notably absent in these authoritarian readings is any emphasis on humans bearing the image of God in Genesis 1:27, humans serving as stewards of God's creation in Genesis 1:28, and in Matthew, Jesus' command to not only make disciples, but also to, quote, "teach them to obey everything I have commanded you." What does that mean? This includes Jesus' teachings on neighborly love, enemy love, power, money, inclusive table fellowship, along with Jesus' example of mobilizing an unarmed mission that lacks a military and emphasizes servanthood rather than domination. Finally, it is worth observing that Matthew 28 did not become the Great Commission until the doctrine of discovery emerged to transform the text into an imperial vision of Christianizing distant lands through colonization and genocide. It might seem like low-hanging fruit to point some of this out, but stating publicly that no early Christian ever thought about the seven mountain mandate through Genesis 1 or Matthew 28 can animate anachronism where it hurts by appealing to the Bible and the Christian tradition itself. In conclusion, pundits often blame Christian nationalist radicalization on evangelicalism, the Republican Party, Fox News, and Trump. No question, these are all legitimate vectors for radicalization. However, a big however, an equally if not more influential medium for radicalization is biblical authoritarianism, since the Bible, broadly speaking, is the foundation narrative for many loyalists across these platforms. Biblical interpretation, therefore, matters for challenging Christian nationalism and deserves a place at the table of peace and human security studies. By ourselves, we are not very powerful, but together we have power. We urgently need ecumenical and interfaith spaces to convene scholars and faith leaders to talk with one another, to offer support to one another, and to test and share pedagogies of resistance as we imagine and disseminate a more responsible and life-giving way of leveraging the biblical narrative for the common good. I look forward to advancing those conversations and that work today through this collaboration here at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you.
So first, thank you to the Institute for Social Concerns and to the University of Notre Dame for convening this meeting. I think that in this particular historical political moment, religious universities have a unique role to play, and I'm grateful that the University of Notre Dame is leaning into this moment. So, how can we explain the widespread support for Donald Trump? Was it white male grievance, unprecedented levels of disinformation, manipulating algorithms, Democrats' ineptitude, misguided economic populism, the price of eggs? Drew makes a compelling case that we need to include biblical interpretation on this list. Drew positions dominionist authoritarian readings of the Bible at the heart of what David Gushee has called authoritarian reactionary Christian politics. Here we have converging legacies of white supremacy, patriarchy, and the doctrine of discovery finding expression in fascist politics that have taken hold within hard and soft versions of white Christian nationalism. Now, Drew does not mince words, and I appreciate that. I think our current circumstances require this level of frankness. And in his assessment, I think he's right. Too often we hear that politics has hijacked religion. And on some level, I understand this framing. Sociologically, we can see that religion tends to be downstream of politics, much as religious believers like to insist the reverse. Moreover, to those who have seen their own religious communities embrace a set of values contradictory to what they believe to be the core values of their faith, it certainly can seem like a hijacked situation. But this language runs the risk of absolving religious figures, pastors, theologians, publishers, leaders of parachurch organizations, and people in the pews, of responsibility, not just in capitulating, but in proactively bringing us to this place. Appreciating the role biblical interpretation plays in undermining our democracy, Drew proposes a number of steps to combat what Christians of his ilk and mine perceive to be a distortion of Christian theology. Do more public-facing biblical interpretation. Draw attention to reception history, build counter-narratives to inoculate believers from dominionist authoritarian readings of the scripture and the like. And all of his proposals are excellent ones. That said, as a historian, I am here to tell you why this admirable agenda will be incredibly difficult to accomplish. I'm always a downer. First, we are up against a tradition of interpretation that does not see itself as a tradition of interpretation. It is God's truth, plain and simple. And everything else is an attack on truth and undermining of certainty of the faith itself. Yet, as scholars like Tim Glugg have shown, fundamentalist and evangelical arguments for the plain reading of the scriptures were in fact modern approaches to the scriptures. Now, where theological modernists acknowledge their accommodation to contemporary cultural and intellectual developments, fundamentalists marketed their ideas as conservative. And they did conserve certain doctrines, but this terminology also masked theological innovation with respect to understandings of salvation, the role of the will, sanctification, the work of the Holy Spirit, the nature of ecclesiastical authority, and the like. Fundamentalists, however, who, by the way, comprised part of the wider evangelical movement, and the separation between the two has never been as distinct as many participants and observers have claimed it to be. They drew on modern advertising techniques to brand their innovative movement old-time religion, and to deny using any interpretive hermeneutic beyond directly receiving and then reiterating historic Christian truth. Asserting the timelessness of their convictions, they drew a straight line between Christ, the early church, and themselves, masking immense change. Assertions of timeless truth have functioned as a powerful weapon against Christians who acknowledge their situatedness, to Christians who are more open about the challenges, including just human limitation, in ascertaining with absolute certainty the mysteries of divine truth. Now, this is why historical study can be so disruptive. When I published Jesus and John Wayne, I was not fully aware of just how disruptive it could be. I'd only partially understood how tightly evangelicals had controlled their own historical narratives. And they had done so as part of a larger theological project. And within the same spaces, forming their own academic societies, creating and gatekeeping a publishing and media ecosystem, they produced self-congratulatory narratives presenting evangelicals always as the good guys and the evangelical worldview as God received wisdom rather than as something made by the hands of men. Many scholars of evangelicalism, many who were themselves evangelicals, reinforce this narrative, generally taking evangelicals at their word, or in some cases acting as explicit apologists for the tradition. They framed things like the whiteness of the movement as inadvertent, if noted at all, and patriarchy, indeed an increasingly rigid authoritarian interpretation of patriarchy, simply as biblical, removing it from the realm of historical, political, or even ethical examination. Simply pulling back the veil on how things came to be, on change over time, on who was doing what and to what ends and with what consequences, has proven enormously disruptive to a community that has for so long controlled their narrative. Now, the frustration on the part of certain gatekeepers was something that I experienced firsthand. If you were on Twitter a few years back, you got to watch it yourselves. Trained in apologetics and reared on insider scholarship, they were expert theological debaters. But when the conversation moved to the historical terrain, they lost their footing. Unable to engage historical argument, they sought instead to interrogate my theology. According to their rules, a version of presuppositionalism, I think, this was their way to discredit my historical scholarship and diminish its power in their own circles. What was my view of homosexuality? On penal substitutionary atonement, did I adhere to the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy? Now, I hadn't anticipated that my personal faith would be of such interest, and other historians from outside the tradition who caught glimpses of this interrogation on social media were bewildered. They sent me DMs. What is going on, Kristin? Who are these people? Do they not understand the discipline of history? They did not. To them, history was inseparable from apologetics. Challenging their historical narratives in their world undermined their truth claims. It needn't do so, I pointed out. Showing how the sausage is made, and in some cases made very recently, does not necessarily undermine its quality or the quality of one's truth claims. Maybe the 250 conservative, evangelical white men who drafted and signed the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy in 1978 before heading to the hotel buffet breakfast, maybe they got things exactly right. But if they are trying to prove that they did by drawing a seamless line from God's direct revelation to this 1978 statement, that's where things get dicey. When you know a little history, for example, it becomes more difficult to characterize biblical inerrancy simply as a return to historic Christian truth, disconnected from any contemporary cultural or political motivations. Now, if we look at those men enjoying the buffet breakfast, we will recognize a number of figures who were already then deeply invested in partisan politics. Men like Bill Bright, Paul Pressler, Paige Patterson, and W.A. Criswell, to name just a few. Let's just take a look at Bright here today. Bright always liked to present himself and his organization, Campus Crusade for Christ, as apolitical. But this is not supportable if you know the history. As Matthew can tell you, Bright was instrumental in bringing together two strands of theological and cultural dominionism. Just 3 years earlier, in 1975, over dinner with Lauren Cunningham of YWAM, the two men discovered that they had both just received direct revelations from God for how to disciple the nation. And sketching this out together, they developed a framework that would become eventually the foundation of Seven Mountain Dominionism. The plan drew directly on the Christian Reconstructionism of R.J. Rushdoony and on the hierarchical authoritarian teachings that had taken hold in charismatic spaces via the influence of the latter rain and the shepherding movements. And again, as Matthew can tell you, latter rain and this meeting of Bright and Cunningham are key pieces in the development of the New Apostolic Reformation via Lance Wallnau. And we all know the political repercussions of this tradition in the Trump era, or if you don't, just look at images of January 6th. But it didn't become political down the road. It was political from its start. The year before, 1974, before his dinner with Cunningham, Bright teamed up with Republican Senator John Conlon, along with wealthy businessmen Rich DeVos and Art DeMoss, Christian Reconstructionist Russ Walton, and a handful of other influential religious and business leaders to devise a plan to save America. Bill Bright really liked plans. A plan to elect the right kind of Christians to political office. To do this, they would utilize local prayer groups, Bible studies, and Sunday school to, in their words, politicize, educate, and activate people in every congressional district. They established a publishing house to disseminate conservative political and economic thought, quote unquote, based on scriptural principles. Russ Walton became chief editor and authored one of its most notable books, One Nation Under God, which drew heavily on Rushdoony to argue that the Constitution was, and I quote, designed to perpetuate a Christian order. one that was a republic, not a democracy. Free enterprise was touted as a manifestation of the Christian idea, and Walton also conjured Christian rationales for abolishing the minimum wage, eliminating compulsory education and right-to-work laws, defunding public schools, and rejecting every means of social reform or redistribution of wealth. Following Rushdoony's hierarchical ordering of society, Walton thought reinstituting patriarchy would restore America, and he called for wives to submit to husbands. As he put it, God-fearing, Bible-believing Christian women would find joy in staying home, nurturing children, frying chicken, and loving and serving their husbands. Feminism and the ERA contradicted the law of God, etc., etc. They also printed a handbook for winning elections. They trained regional directors to recruit teams in each congressional district and published ratings of members of Congress based on their alignment with, and here are their terms, individual freedom, fiscal responsibility, free competitive enterprise, and constitutional government based on God's laws, and also their opposition to such things as a federal agency for consumer advocacy. Bright's plan didn't come cheap, and he and Conlon set out to raise $100 million. Fortunately, both of them were well connected to wealthy businessmen. DeVos and DeMoss, as we've seen, J. Howard Pugh, Nelson Bunker Hunt, and others. Now, these businessmen, in Conlon's words, seemed ready to put their money where their mouths are. He observed also that these businessmen were starting to pay attention to what was going on inside evangelical seminaries. And he pointed specifically to Harold Lindsell's book that helped spark the inerrancy movement, The Battle for the Bible. Which is to say, at the time, it was clear to participants that inerrancy, right-wing political power, and corporate interests were all tightly linked. And it was a powerful convergence, and one not accomplished, according to one observer at the time, without, and I quote, a dangerously high level of self-righteousness and an implicit or explicit call to believers to abandon all critical thinking. Now, Bright, of course, dictated God's plan for every single person. Biblical inerrantists dictated the only acceptable way to read the Bible. An emerging Christian right positioned themselves as arbiters of moral authority. We're pro-life, pro-family, pro-morals, and pro-America, they said, and any difference on any point was deemed, and I quote, inconsistent with Christianity. Now, much more could be said about these emerging networks and alliances. The establishment of the Christian Embassy, the conservative takeover of the SBC, the Council for National Policy, all of these were part of this larger movement, as was inerrancy. Now, in Jesus and John Wayne, I wrote that the battle over inerrancy was in part a proxy fight over gender. This line provoked the ire of certain conservative evangelical leaders, particularly those affiliated with the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. I got too much credit or blame for this. I was merely citing the excellent scholarship of Elizabeth Flowers and Seth Dowland on this matter. But it does not take a scholar to point out that inerrancy has always been selectively applied. Passages on the submission of women or on homosexuality as an abomination, they get the inerrancy treatment. Passages, as we already heard, on welcoming the stranger, loving enemies, selling everything to give to the poor, rich men and camels, or in Christ there is no male or female, these do not receive the same plain reading. Who decides which passages get the inerrancy treatment? This is where we need to see the hidden and not so hidden authority structures within these communities. The patterns of deference and authority, the institutional gatekeeping, the mechanisms of exclusion and coercion, as well as, and very importantly, rewards for loyalty and submission, and also the money. This is what we are up against. To understand biblical authoritarianism, and certainly how to counter it, we have to understand this history, how the system came to be and how it has been ruthlessly enforced. Now as then, there are powerful alliances between pastors, political leaders, and wealthy businessmen to ensure that the system endures unchallenged, or at the very least, that those who dare to challenge it will pay a price. Now, back then, that looked like funding for conferences and publishers and parachurch organizations and direct mail campaigns and church bulletin inserts. Now it is all that and more. Social media platforms and algorithms amplifying one side and suppressing or just swamping the other. So yes, we should do theology in public. And yes, progressives and moderates have hurt their cause by failing to do so. We must develop counter-narratives, and we should not be afraid to experiment with new modes of communication and amplification. And we must also recognize that we are up against enormous odds. This has been true for the past 5 decades or more, and increasingly so in recent years, recent months, and even recent weeks. This is a David and Goliath scenario. I am all for gathering our stones, taking aim, and praying that the system can be dismantled with honest exposure, good faith engagement, and the grace of God and the perseverance of the saints.
Good morning. I am very grateful for Drew Strait, who is both one of the organizers of this conference and also a real thought leader in this area. And I think he has highlighted this morning the challenge that is before us. And I think Kristin, who is a harbinger of our times and one of the real clarion voices in our world right now, has given us a bracing challenge, and I think an entirely accurate one. So what I'd like to do is try to extend some of what Drew was saying and try to think even a little more visually and looking forward practically about what it would look like to take a movement of biblical interpretation and have that become part of the resistance to all of this. And just by way of context, right now, Donald Trump has become the president again, and he would not be the president right now were it not for these Christian supremacist theologies that have sanctified him and made him into a quasi-messianic figure in many Christian circles. And if you think that that sounds a little bit extreme, if you think that sounds like I'm exaggerating, if you think that sounds fringe, I have bad news for you. You're fringe. That's very mainstream in Christianity right now. And Donald Trump has leaned into these narratives. He has embraced this narrative of prophecy, that he is a figure of divine destiny. Whether he believes it or not, he has utilized that to great rhetorical effect, and I would argue that he could not have had the comeback that he has had since January 6th, apart from these sacralizing theologies that have surrounded him and enshrouded him with this mythos of being this figure of divine destiny. So if he is to be stopped, and if MAGA is to be stopped, these theologies must be countered and dismantled. So what will that look like? Well, one of the things that got left out last night, I'm sorry, I put a lot on my slides, but one of the things that got left out last night in our talk about Christian nationalism is it's not a single thing. It's not a monolithic entity. And if you look at any of the survey data, you realize that there is a spectrum of Christian nationalism. And whether you use the language of sympathizers and adherents, or I forget what the language that PRI uses, we have a spectrum. And that spectrum runs from more soft forms of Christian nationalism, and I have here a symbol of an American flag alongside a Christian flag in the chancel of a church. I grew up going to churches like that, right? These soft forms of Christian nationalism tend to be more passive, more sentimental and nostalgic, wanting to hearken back to a previous era, always ambiguous what that era is, and also more sympathetic with democracy. If you ask many people who answer positively on some of the Christian nationalism questions on surveys, they'll often say that they want to preserve the separation of church and state, that they want to not have the Bible integrated into lawmaking. But on the further end of the spectrum, we have these more hardline forms of Christian nationalism, what I call Christian supremacy, that tend to be far more organized, more anti-democratic, and more theological. The more theology you introduce into your Christian nationalism, the more radical it becomes, because you are wedding it to a cosmic vision, not just a sense of nostalgia or emotion. And so, when we talk about radicalization in the Christian community, it's pulling people from these more garden variety, soft forms of Christian nationalism into these hardline forms of Christian supremacy. And radicalization, some of the forces that are at work right now in our society are things like conspiracy theories, especially after January 6th. Coming into the 2024 election, 1/3 of Americans believe that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. 1/3 of Americans. And if you looked among white evangelicals, it was closer to 2/3. You cannot believe that unless you believe conspiracy theories. And so conspiracy theories have taken root in a huge portion of our population. You also have, as Drew and Kristin have really aptly pointed out, a biblical reinterpretation project that is convincing and appealing to many, many evangelicals, using evangelical styles of biblical appeal to draw people into these more radical theologies. You also have this dynamic of these modern prophecies, not just biblical prophecies. Yes, people try to connect Trump to figures from the Bible, but there are many, many, many charismatic believers who believe in modern prophecy and believe that their prophets have prophesied Trump's victories. There are hundreds of these prophecies, and that is what is fueling this mythos around him, this belief that he is the specially appointed figure. And of course, we also have advances in philosophy and theology. This can get formal and intellectual. It's not merely lowbrow appealing to the Bible. Some of this is quite erudite. And it's even coming from institutions like this, where you have elite figures, well-trained intellectual figures. I went to Fuller Theological Seminary. Many of the advances of the New Apostolic Reformation came out of Fuller Theological Seminary, even though it's a very mainstream evangelical seminary, at least in its reputation. So I would argue that right now we have basically three major strands of American Christian supremacy. And there are other varieties, but these are the ascendant strands. And I'll just outline them very briefly just to give you a sense. The first is what we could call an anti-Vatican II Catholic traditionalism. And I'm using a fairly big tent terms here because I'm not Catholic, and I find when I listen to Catholics speak about Protestant Christian nationalism, I'm always like, not quite right. So I don't pretend to be an expert on Catholic Christian nationalism. I'm sure there's many, many people in this room who are far more well-briefed on that and could give you much better information. But I can recognize that there are intellectual and populist strands of this. And they are especially influential through our current Supreme Court, but now they have an avatar in the White House themselves in the form of J.D. Vance, who himself, within the last 6 weeks, has picked fights with both the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and Pope Francis. And I'm not Catholic, but if you're in a theological fight with a pope and you're Catholic, I would argue it's a moment for reflection. He wears it as a badge of courage. And this, through these folks, they've often, we find, and I think this is an important distinction, appeals to Catholic history and tradition, especially the theology of Thomas Aquinas. And so for those of us who are Protestants who always want to defer back to this biblical interpretation paradigm, that might not work all the time with Catholics. Because again, it's a different set of sources of authority. And we also have, as Kristin really helpfully outlined, these more Reformed and Reconstructionist forms of Christian nationalism. Reformed is, of course, a synonym here for Calvinist. And here I think actually Christian nationalism is a pretty effective term because they've embraced that term. And you have people like Stephen and William Wolfe, or like Andrew Torba, who is the founder of the far-right social media website Gab. And this tendency is very, very intellectual and hyper-masculine. This is where we have this phenomenon that we call the Theo-bros that we keep finding. They always have big beards. I don't know why. And these folks are not as popular, not as widespread, not as well read throughout the whole population of evangelicals. They're very influential with Christian thought leaders, though, and have been since the 1960s. And they now have their own avatar in the administration in the form of Pete Hegseth, who attends one of these very Reformed churches in Doug Wilson's network, and who has espoused many of these ideas. And they are doing biblical interpretation, but they're doing it through the lens of systematic Calvinist theology. which is very important, that they are not merely doing a kind of bald appeal to the text. This is happening through formal theological conversations. And then this is where you start finding these terms like theonomy or presuppositionalism or dominion, right? Those things are coming out of more formal theology. And so if you're going to understand and counter it, you need to understand the theology underneath it. And then the third is the movement that I study, the independent charismatics, who are leaders in spiritual warfare as they understand it. This is the realm of the New Apostolic Reformation, but this is also the realm of the Word of Faith, prosperity gospel movement. This is the realm of televangelism and megachurches. This one tends to be far more populist and energetic and experientially immersive. This stuff is spreading like wildfire in the American population and in the global population. In fact, independent charismatics are one of the fastest growing religious movements in global history. And right now, all three of these, I would say, are very scary. But the independent charismatics are the ones who are really on the upswing at this moment. They are populating Trump's advisory circles. They're extremely influential with the MAGA base. And this charismatic spirituality that they are driving, especially built around these prophecies, is taking over as the spirituality of the far right, as a sort of lingua franca among Christians in the far right, using the language of spiritual warfare, of demonology, and of going after their enemies and saying, our enemies are on the side of Satan because we're on the side of the angels. They are doing biblical exegesis, and it sounds evangelical in a conventional sense, but actually it's being filtered through these modern prophecies and through the Seven Mountain Mandate. This conception of society that has originated within these circles, but actually traces back to the Reconstructionists, as Kristin was pointing out. So this is the challenge before us. This is the field as it currently stands. I want to talk about how Americans are divided up right now. And this is a heuristic. It's not meant to be perfectly representative, but I would argue that our society is roughly divided into thirds at this moment, informationally and socially and politically. On the right, we have the MAGA propaganda bubble that, as I said, makes up at least a third of the country who buy into these conspiracy theories and who are informationally cut off from reality. There was talk last night about disinformation. These folks are perpetual consumers of disinformation. And sometimes when we get into arguments with them, we think, how can they not understand all the scandals that Trump has occasioned? Because they've never heard of them. They don't know about them. They are not informed about them because of their information sources. These folks are mostly rural and ex-urban and suburban. Many of them are overtly Christian supremacist in their orientation. Many of them are overtly white supremacist. I kid you not, Nazism is on the table for these folks. Not in a kind of like casual way. They actually are playing footsie with literal Nazism. And they buy into these conspiracy theories about the 2020 election and support Trump unwaveringly. And Trump could destroy the US economy. He could inaugurate World War III. They would be with him. On the other end of the spectrum is the liberal bubble, probably where most of us in this room find ourselves. We live in the blue dots, urban and suburban areas on the map. I think we need to always remember that in 2024, Donald Trump won 90% of the counties in the United States. So the rest of us live in those 10% of the blue dots. We are generally engaged with factual reality. We consume mainstream media, but that also puts us in a bubble because there's a fairly narrow cultural consensus that obtains within that third. And within that third, and I speak again as a participant in that third, Kamala Harris looked like an absolute knockout candidate for president. Why would anyone vote for Donald Trump over her? And yet they did. That we couldn't see it because we were in our own little bubble. And then in the middle, we have this confusing other bubble. That's the third, that these are folks who live everywhere. Many of them aren't registered to vote. They're Christians, but it's eclectic and confusing forms of Christianity. Many of them are these nuns, these disillusioned nuns. They have chaotic information diets. They are not heavily engaged in politics. And their disaffection with the current system has led many of them to be authoritarian curious. And Donald Trump's brilliance in this election was he figured out how to appeal to those people in the middle. He went on their podcasts. He hung out on their YouTube shows. He spoke their language and he appealed to them. And he won them over. So if we are going to build a coalition that will overpower and overcome this, we need a coalition of the 2/3. Because elections, and this is true if you look around the world, when populist authoritarian governments take over, part of the playbook is they start to rig elections. And I say that not in terms of, oh, they're going to start messing with the vote count. There's all kinds of ways to rig elections. You can do it bureaucratically. You can prosecute your opponents. You can tie them up with tax audits. There's all kinds of ways to start rigging elections. That is just part of the playbook. And so from here on out, elections only get harder. And we need a 2/3 coalition to be able to overpower this MAGA coalition. So we need to debate the MAGA camp publicly, and we need to dialogue with people in the middle. And I'll just say this because I'm in a room on a university campus with a lot of educated people. The main divide between you and them is not politics, it's education. And if you don't know, if you aren't in regular contact with people who don't have a college degree, then you aren't in touch with the middle third. You don't know them. But they're the people we need to enlist. We need to build this big tent that will bring them in. So as I wrap up, I want to try to turn very practical here and talk about how can Protestant theology and biblical studies help build this 60% plus coalition for democracy. And I think I'm just highlighting in the corner there these related challenges. I'm not going to delve into these today, but one of these is mainline Protestants' biblical illiteracy. Oh, sorry. Went the wrong direction. There we go. Mainline Protestants' biblical illiteracy. And I say this as somebody who is a mainline Protestant now. Mainline Protestants need to get up on their Bible. I speak in churches all the time, and I am talking about the NAR, I'm talking about January 6th, and I get to the end and they're like, man, this is overwhelming, and they have so many Bible references. And my response is, get some freaking Bible references of your own. I thought you were Protestants. But this is a widespread problem that we need to deal with. And I also want to think about, can evangelical denominations and parachurch organizations be of aid to us in this process? Or have they already been co-opted by MAGA? And it's probably a more complicated picture than just a single answer, but I genuinely don't know how much they can be of aid to us. So here are these are my lessons that I take from watching the far right and its organizing principles and its strengths, and seeing if we can learn from them. First, New Testament exegesis is our at-home playing field. The early church was deeply anti-imperial and anti-authoritarian. They weren't perfect. They didn't always agree on everything. But where they were solid was that they resisted the imperial cult that demanded that they bow to Caesar. That was why they were persecuted. It wasn't because they were monotheists. It wasn't because they were good and pious people. It was because they resisted the imperial cult. And we have a new imperial cult in America that is rapidly taking over. And so we need to go and do New Testament Bible study, not just formal exegesis, but Bible study. Second, I think we need to find ways to take the theologies that we create and turn them viral and inspiring and have them be carried by media, the current media, not the media of the last generation. Books and academic essays and highbrow conferences like this won't do it. We need resistance influencers and compelling messengers to spread these messages because we are outgunned, literally and online. We also need lateral and subterranean networks because I've got bad news for all of us. If you watch how things are going right now, I'm not sure a year from now if we'll be allowed to have conferences like this in open. So we need to find ways to do this in subterranean ways because these big institutions that we are so fond of have atrophied and are very easy to topple, as we are watching happen day by day. We need diffuse networks of Christian leaders and teachers and activists because that's what they have on the right, and they've built it over decades. Fourth, we need to let 1,000 theological flowers bloom. We don't need a single message. We don't need to all be unified. The messages that are going to work in countering the Reconstructionists are not going to work always in countering the Charismatics. And what might work with both of those Protestant groups will probably not work with the Catholic folks. And what about the Eastern Orthodox? So we need to have a lot of different forms of resistance theology, not a single unified message, but 1,000 points of light. We also need no purity tests. We can't be going around demanding, well, your anti-Trump theology isn't sufficient because it doesn't hit my 3 important points. And sometimes the people who are best equipped to dismantle Christian supremacy are Christian nationalists. They're the ones they'll actually listen to. And finally, this will be the work of decades and of generations. As Kristin, I think, very helpfully observed, this stuff did not emerge in the Trump era. This stuff did not emerge in the 21st century. Many of the things that we're seeing go back to at least the 1960s, if not earlier, and have been forming for decades and for generations. And so if we're going to stop it, we need to think in terms of generations and decades. And as Rabbi Tarfon says in the Talmud, it is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it. So I'm going to end with a concrete proposal. I would love to see a diffuse network of Bible studies all over the nation entirely focused on the Gospel of Mark. Mark is the most rebellious of the Gospels, the most anti-imperial. Just to give you, do I got 1 minute? Okay, just to give you a little sample. The term gospel, Mark is the first gospel. It's written in the probably late 60s, early 70s. The term gospel was an imperial term. The Caesars were using the term gospel. We found the inscriptions where they go around writing inscriptions. Good news, glad tidings, you've been conquered. And a God has descended from heaven and conquered you. And it's Caesar. And so you live in the Pax Romana. You live in the imperial age, and Caesar dominates you, so you are safe. And so when Mark, in the first line of the gospel, appropriates the imperial term and says, this is the beginning of the gospel, the evangelion of Jesus Christ, Son of God, the one that the Caesar crucified, that is an implicit challenge to Caesar. And that theme is embedded all throughout Mark's gospel. And so what if we had a diffuse network of churches and communities studying the gospel of Mark intently with this anti-imperial lens as a way of putting some steel in the spine of resistance Christians? If you were interested in helping make that happen, I'd be very interested in having that conversation. Thank you.
Okay, now I'd like to invite us to take another 15 seconds of silence to center ourselves before we enter our time of questions and answers. Okay, well, the code is up on the screen again, so if you have questions, feel free to scan that and submit. We do have a couple already, but also, Drew, feel free to take up and respond to any points that Kristin and Matthew have raised. So first question here for Drew. You've been making many of the interventions you propose for a while now. Can you offer an example of 1 or 2 successes or failures that you've encountered?
Sure, it's a great question. In the broader project on this, I think I'm up to like 12 interventions, so I'm only sharing 5 of those today. But I think one of the most important interventions is confronting our epidemic of loneliness. The U.S. Surgeon General published an 85-page report on our epidemic of loneliness roughly 3 years ago. And in its conclusion, these scientists and cardiologists and doctors argue that Americans are sick, angry, and alone. Those are their words and not mine. And I think in that space of being sick, angry, and alone, this creates the context and the conditions for radicalization, especially as people are looking for community online. I mean, one of the things they show is that Americans spend 20 hours less a month with friends and 24 hours more a month by themselves since 20 years ago. And so in that context, we're seeing a space where that is incubating radicalization. And so often when we kind of feel like deer caught in the headlights with all of this going on, we read Matthew's book, and we're like, oh my goodness, what should we do? Our first reaction is that, well, we need to go build something. But I think we actually don't need to build something. The infrastructure for this work, including addressing our epidemic loneliness, is already in place in mosques, in synagogues, and in churches. Faith communities offer us an infrastructure that already exists for mobilizing people power, even if it's going to be a long and very challenging journey ahead of us.
Great. Well, in the spirit of maybe participating but not building something, another question: where and when can I sign up for Matthew's concrete proposal and/or Drew's efforts?
Come talk to me afterwards. But you could go. So I work at the Institute for Islamic Christian and Jewish Studies. You can go on our website and sign up for email list. We're working on some things around this, and Drew and I are also talking about some potential future collaborations. So get on our email list.
Okay, another question: how much of the radicalization process is due to psychological profiles?
Yeah, I've actually got some data I'll just read to you right now with regard to QAnon offenders who've committed violent crimes. It's worth noting that 41% of the 44 QAnon offenders who committed violent crimes before and after the January 6th insurrection radicalized after experiencing trauma, including PTSD from military service, sexualized or physical violence, or the premature death of loved ones. Moreover, 60% of the 44 QAnon offenders have documented mental health concerns. So epidemic of loneliness and mental health are two major issues we need to be thinking critically about as we're confronting Christian nationalism. Yeah, can you say the question one more time for me?
Yeah, how much of the radicalization process is due to the psychological profiles of those who are being radicalized?
Yeah, so I think a lot. Mental health is a major vector for radicalization.
And just one further comment. I know it was mentioned last night. We cannot underestimate the role that COVID and isolation from COVID played around all of this. The way that all of those factors converged in 2020 around COVID, and then George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter protests, and then the election and Trump's denial, all of that spiraled into January 6th. And we are increasingly have a high probability of another pandemic with this bird flu thing that is increasingly growing in the hinterlands, and that with RFK at the top of the chain. So I think we need to be aware that that could spur things into an even worse cycle.
Another question: as Christians, why are we focusing more on Christian nationalism rather than on the false prophets and false apostles who are pushing it?
So I'm fine with using the language of false prophets and false apostles as a theological claim, but that's not a good entry point for conversation. Right? So, I mean, I think there's this way that many of us who are Christians, because we don't believe in modern prophecy, will say anyone who claims to be a modern prophet is therefore a false prophet. But if you're going to dialogue with Pentecostals and charismatics, that is not a starting point. And it also is a starting point of disrespect to say your religious leaders aren't religious leaders that I will recognize. Right? You call Ayatollah Khomeini Ayatollah. I don't think that many of the people in the room think that the Ayatollah is a sign from God, which is what Ayatollah means. That's the title that you offer to them. Those of us who are not Protestant call Pope Francis, even though he's not our Pope, right? So I think part of beginning a conversation with a community is acknowledging the language that they use and the religious frames that they use. And if people believe in prophets, those people are prophets. They're not my prophet, but they are prophets. And so I think beginning with, I often find too, that trying to just use this frame of heresy, it's a very easy one for us Christians. It's right there in the grab bag, right? A lot of Christian history to use around that one. Where exactly are they heretics? Show me from the Nicene Creed, or really any of the ecumenical creeds, where they've gone wrong. because they are saying the creeds and not crossing their fingers. So I think that heresy is not always the right frame to use. And also, heresy is a way of, in the Christian tradition, saying, I've cut you off and I don't have to have any responsibility for you anymore. But as Christians, we do need to take responsibility for this. I think that heresy is a little bit too much of an easy out.
If I could jump in here, I mean, it's yes to what Matthew was saying, but I'm guessing many in this room may be sensing a kind of asymmetry here, because folks in the Christian supremacist camp have no qualms about calling us apostate, heretics. And I mean, I have a whole list that I've been called, child of the devil, false teacher, a wolf, all of these things, right? And very early on, I just kind of laughed that off. And then I realized, no, they mean that quite seriously. And these terms have very real meaning in those spaces. And so I don't use that kind of language because for reasons that Matthew said, but also that is taking on a certain kind of authority to dictate, essentially to separate the sheep from the goats, which is, as I read the scripture, not my ultimate responsibility to do. However, I am also deeply aware of the fact that that plays very well to certain psychological profiles. People want that certainty to these authority structures. And at the heart of Christian nationalism is an us versus them mentality. And it feels very, very good to be very clearly on the side of the righteous. And then anything that comes at you, any critique at all, is an enemy of God because you are on God's side. And I see how this plays out, and it's stunning. And so we can talk about, you talk about humility, and there's all theological traditions. I'm a Calvinist, and so I'm looking at my fellow Calvinist Theo bros, completely embracing this Christian nationalism that has no place in it for their own fallenness, for their own sin. That the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And so you proceed with great caution, right? So there's a theological framework for my position, but I also realize it's not the most attractive one psychologically. And it is not the best framework if you're trying to build a political movement.
Okay, another question. I'm a college educator and campus minister, and a trend that I've seen on our campus is the student leadership of our college Republicans are also the same leaders for an underground Turning Point USA chapter, a MAGA organization. How do we help students see the difference between Republican Party ideals and MAGA, thinking especially of the many students who take a party stance on abortion as a key issue?
I'll maybe try it with an anecdote. The Women's March, the day after Trump's first inauguration, one of the controversies that emerged around that was that many of the pro-choice organizing groups banned pro-life feminist groups from joining. That is the kind of purity test we don't need. And so I think there needs to be room in any anti-Trump, anti-MAGA coalition for pro-life people. And that doesn't mean that we need to not talk about abortion or set that aside. We can have conversation, we can have dialogue around that, but there needs to be room for that. We cannot start drawing these purity test lines that say, if you do not line up with all of my political talking points, I'm not going to be in coalition with you. Part of the brilliance of the Christian right is if you dive into what they actually believe, they have huge disagreements. But they've set those aside for the purpose of taking over society, and they're winning.
Yeah, and in defense of these students who are not adequately distinguishing the MAGA movement from the Republican Party, they weren't the first ones here, right? What we do have is essentially the total capitulation of one of our political parties, which is why we are in this dire situation today, and so an absolute failure of leadership. political leadership. And, on college campuses, I think respecting young leaders is important, staying in dialogue with those young leaders, and maybe planting the seed for a student-led movement that could, if we're not seeing it from the top down, what would that look like from the bottom up? I know too, years ago when we had an unofficial Turning Point chapter set up at my home university, Calvin, initially I thought, okay, it's going to be kind of a Calvin flavor of TPUSA. It was not. It was straight up TPUSA, right? Coming and kind of colonizing this, which is not what we're supposed to do. We're reformers, and we reform everything, and we, have reformed Christian versions of things, and that was not what this is. And so I think staying in dialogue. No purity tests. Absolutely. Every time I go into progressive political spaces, that is my theme. And it is very difficult for progressive pro-democracy activists to, intellectually, they know they need to do that. They seem open to that, and then they snap right back. And, and I think a big tent is what we need. And if you cannot see that in this moment and then actually carry that through and act on that, and I'm in progressive spaces, I'm inviting into the spaces that care about religion and that want to work with religious folks. And even then it is exceedingly difficult for them to do so. And so we definitely have work to do in those spaces.
Yeah, in brief, I think I'd see this as an opportunity. I think we need mass trainings on dialogue, the arts of dialogue in congregations, but also on college campuses. We are paralyzed by our inability to talk across human difference. And I'm thinking here of people like Megan Zwart at St. Mary's College across the street. She runs the Dialogue and Democracy Initiative, is doing remarkable work on creating these kinds of spaces in her classrooms to talk about hot potato issues. So I cannot emphasize this enough. We need mass trainings on dialogue. And the goal here is not conversion. It's just getting to a place where we minimize harm so we're not hurting one another in public.
And can I just say a word about dialogue, because I work at a dialogue institute. I don't think you can dialogue with the MAGA third.
Yeah.
At least not right now, not when they're winning. Maybe 10 years from now, if there are things turn around, maybe there's a chance for them to change their minds. They are not going to change their minds right now. We need to dialogue with the middle third, the folks who are persuadable in that. And it's hard sometimes to discern, because many people in the middle third also voted for Trump. He wouldn't get to 50% without getting at least half of them. So we need to find ways to dialogue with those folks. Jim Wallace has a very nice crystallization of, in a democracy, you need to figure out who can be persuaded and who needs to be defeated. MAGA needs to be defeated. And I don't think it's going to be fruitful to try to dialogue with those folks. They are not living in reality. So I think we need to build this big coalition to defeat them. They're still human beings. They're created in God's image. We can love them. Politically, you can't persuade them.
I would also just add, when we're thinking about changing minds, we need to be thinking in incremental steps, not wholesale conversion again. There's an organizing tool called the Spectrum of Allies that argues that if we could just get everyone to shift one notch over to the left, not all the way, but just one notch around questions like immigration, our society would change pretty dramatically.
So here we go. As an ecclesiologist, I note that the presenters all reference the terms authority, authoritarian, and authoritarianism. This term was always applied to Christian nationalists. Authority is always present in every human society and community. When the conversation about authority, faithful or not, is implicit or not explicitly parsed, a vacuum is there to be filled. So what do our presenters have to say about the need for explicit conversations about faithful Christian functions of authority that can disempower the implicit authority systems of Christian nationalism?
Yeah, I'll riff a little bit off of Matthew's talk today and just say that I think the person of the historical Jesus is the most disorienting paradigm we have for thinking about authority, because we need to speak a common language and use a theological paradigm that Christian nationalists understand well and that they value. And I think the more that we can scale up creative and thoughtful ways for talking about the anti-imperial nature of the early Jesus movement, we might get some traction and make some ground. The closer we can stay to the biblical text, I know I sound like a fundamentalist now, but in all seriousness, the closer we can stay to the biblical text, the more we're going to keep our audience engaged in dialogue. The second we move away from that, they're just going to call you a leftist, communist, socialist. So this is a huge challenge, but staying close to the life and teachings of Jesus and the biblical narrative is going to be absolutely critical for those of us doing this work.
And I'm not sure what I would offer in terms of a positive vision of Christian authority. There aren't a lot of them right now. Yeah. But I will say, part of how the NAR and these independent charismatics moved into this deeply anti-democratic mode is they got there first in their ecclesiology. They got there first by saying, we've moved past democracy in our churches, and we need these charismatic apostles and prophets to lead us, and they hear direct from God, and therefore we can bypass all of the messiness of democracy in our congregations because we've got these leaders that are ordained by God. And then when Trump came along, it was a natural segue. And so I think we do need to be paying attention to how ecclesiology functions in this conversation, because certain ecclesiologies can set you up to be more sympathetic to authoritarianism. I'm not sure exactly what the positive vision on the other side is yet.
Yeah, I think that absolutely right. The structures are existing, and these frameworks of authority are existing in the religious spaces first, and you can see a shift there. If you look at something like evangelicalism, you can see it has a strong democratic impulse when you're talking about plain reading of the scripture and the priesthood of all believers, going back to the Reformation, right? That's kind of the big separation between Protestantism and Catholicism and modes of authority. But then what you can see, and particularly in the last 150, 200 years, really 150 years, with the kind of democratic impulses of revivalism getting captured into new structures and new theological frameworks then being imposed. And so, yes, every believer gets guidance from the Holy Spirit, but you need to check your guidance against the authority in your small group. And that small group is structured under other authorities. So my book that I'm finishing right now, it's called Live, Laugh, Love. And it looks at, it's the flip side to Jesus and John Wayne, looking at femininity. And what I saw early on in my research is I had a chapter on multi-level marketing. And the more I looked at these multi-level marketing companies and the rules and the indoctrination, and some participants would actually call it brainwashing, the more I realized these structures, this is not just multi-level marketing, this is evangelicalism. This is evangelical parachurch organizations. And then I did more and more digging and I saw common roots here. The quote that I shared, let's see, let me try to find it again. Abandon a dangerously high level of self-righteousness and an implicit or explicit call to believers to abandon all critical thinking. So when we're talking about religious authority, do we still have room for religious liberty, freedom of conscience, common grace? Right? There are theological tools here to also kind of bring to the table to push back against the total submission, total obedience, direct authority, right? And again, all of these are theological conversations to have. But before you can change people's mind, I think it's really important to very accurately depict what is actually happening in these spaces. Because as I think both mentioned, or maybe Matthew in particular, in evangelical spaces, they are using a kind of more generic evangelical language. Yes. To then draw people in, because it sounds like, well, this is Christianity, and that's how it is presented. This is not presented as a new articulation of Christianity. It's not presented as charismatic Christianity. Yes. They do not use these labels. This is just Christianity, and obeying this is obeying God.
Can I just make one other comment on that? We need to also, as we tap into the anti-imperial themes of the New Testament, also tap into the anti-wealth themes of the New Testament? Why have we ceded all the ground of populism to the right? I mean, maybe I missed it, but where are all the sermons about what the Apostle James would say about Elon Musk? Right? Like, what would Jesus say about the growing oligarchy in the United States? And where are the sermons about that on Sunday morning? We need those sermons because that also will help to tap into where undercut this kind of authoritarian claim about power and biblical interpretation.
Well, it's clear this is a conversation that could happen for a much longer time, but our time is up. So please join me in thanking our presenters.